right, welcome into our Jock Market Strategy NFL DFS show. We appreciate you riding with us for the next half hour. So as we dive deep into the Jock Market app, we've been telling you all about this on our shows here on the Awesemo channel, this great, fantastic way in which Jock Market has revolutionized how you play DFS, specifically turning DFS into a stock market. And we'll tell you all about the terminology, the strategy, even a couple of tips. And yes, Greg Ehrenberg's in the house, so you're going to get a couple of pre-looks at some plays. Everything is a little different when it comes to Jock Market versus what I think people are accustomed to. So first and foremost, we welcome Greg in here at G. Ehrenberg DFS. Tyler's in the house producing, so make sure you say hi in the chat. We'll keep all of that open as well, so people who have thoughts, suggestions, and possibly some questions as far as how to play this specifically into Thursday night, we'll keep the chat open and alive. But first and foremost, my friend, I know that this is definitely a different type of show than people are used to, so I feel very comfortable that you are here kind of steering the ship today.
Oh yeah. Well, also we haven't done Jock Market for football because we weren't partnered with them during football season last year. But I did a number of Jock Market basketball shows with Josh Engelman during the basketball season. I can't remember, we did it either Wednesday nights or Thursday nights, but we also did it at a different time of day where those Jock Market shows we did generally after the IPO period, after the games were supposed to have started. But of course, basketball games never start on time, so not exactly when basketball games start, but we did it kind of as the games were tipping off. We're talking about which players started well, which players are doing poorly, and who we wanted to, maybe buy low on or sell high on, because that's one thing with Jock Market. And also it's something that I think a lot of people have questions about. You can reach out to me on Twitter, or if you're in YouTube chat right now, you could ask me any questions about how Jock Market works. But more specifically, at least for now, what we're going to be talking about is some of the overall looking ahead to the Thursday night game. And the IPO bidding is not open yet for Thursday, but maybe some of the players that we might be wanting to place bids on are players that I think could ultimately end up being undervalued by the public, which we don't know for sure. This is just kind of guesstimates. But also on Awesemo.com, we do have fair IPO prices, which are suggested amounts that we believe you should be bidding on players in the IPO period.
Yeah, and great point there, because there are a couple of phrases, terms that people may be newer to overall, especially if they're newer to Jock Market, the IPO, the initial player offering. And you mentioned that it's not open as of yet, will be on Thursday. So you always get a pre-look at it, the pre-IPO specifically. And this is your chance, much like the stock market, right, to jump in and place your bid. And you'll see a couple of different tips in there, especially to max out your bid. You don't need to sit there incrementally and manually do it. Jock Market's going to make sure they'll take care of it, that it'll go up incrementally by 1 cent. If you don't hit it, it will refund your bid for it. But that's the angle, is trying, and you mentioned the value to it, trying to find somebody who maybe you think will be undervalued coming in there, that you may be able to flip as far as in-game is concerned. But really, the IPO looking ahead before these kicks lock in, specifically Thursday night, Greg, would be to try to take advantage of getting in with a hefty bid that you can then turn around for your fair value position and have that break-even point to know that it's a realistic cost to then your expected return, so that you're not overspending for everybody, that you can realistically get a positive return back.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the other thing also is, I don't, like, for myself, I'm not sitting here, I'm not saying like, oh, I'll just eyeball and be like, oh, Tom Brady, he's worth, like $18 a share or whatever. One thing that is really helpful that I mentioned before is that if you do go to Awesemo.com, we do have projections up for Jock Market where, starting right at the top, the player that we have projected to score the most fantasy points in this game and have the highest fair IPO price is Tom Brady. We have him projected for 22.44 fantasy points over on Jock Market. That is a fair IPO value of $16.88. So what I would be doing with that information personally is, let's say the IPO period was open right now and Tom Brady was getting bid at, say, $12 a share. I would try to be over the top of that number, and I'd be willing to go as high as the $16.88 that we currently have projected for him. But, if it starts to get over that, that would be a spot where it's like, okay, this is a little high. You mentioned a break-even point, and at least per our projections, anything above that number would be a little bit too steep to pay for shares of Tom Brady.
So that's I think, one of the interesting elements of the IPO is trying to balance. And again, we'll always go back to our tools that we have as a nice something compatible, if you will, with what we're talking about here specifically for Thursday night's game on Jock Market. But looking at not just some of the bigger names, but trying to find value to where you can, if it's a cheaper bid, get somebody who game flow or narrative could turn into a nice flip, where then once kick happens, you can turn around and flip that stock, if you will, that commodity now for a higher price, if that's the goal, which I think it always is, right? If you're not spending a ton of money on top players, where you can kind of maneuver through maybe that middle or bottom tier of expectation.
Yeah, what's your question? I'm just trying to.
No, it wasn't a question. It was more just a point there, as far as like following up with trying to find value and place that on guys that aren't necessarily looked at coming in to have a higher game, if it's a fantasy performance, right, that we're trying to gauge this on. But if you get them on the cheap, then the beauty of this is that the lineup isn't locked in, right? Jock Market, you'll be able to flip it back. So that's really where you can make some money on a return if you're able to squeeze in somebody that may not be as aggressively bid or highly as bid as Tom Brady.
Yeah, and so I think something else too, because you mentioned in-game being able to buy and sell players, and for football specifically, I think game flow is something to really pay attention to on Thursday night, where, you know, we see this all the time in football games. Let's say, what's the game script? And especially if you play, say, showdown, single game contest on FanDuel or DraftKings, and you kind of want your lineup to tell a story where it's like, all right, I'm predicting this certain type of game flow. This is how my lineup construction works. I think we could see something similar, at least in terms of strategy, but it would be executed differently on Jock Market, where let's say you have shares of the Cowboys passing game, and let's say the Cowboys get up by, I don't know, 30 points or something like that. It's a blowout. And then you go, you know what's going to happen in the second half now? They're going to run the ball with Zeke Elliott, and the passing game now has less value to it. That's kind of an instance where I would be looking to sell high, and then I would be looking at maybe like Elliott as, okay, I want to buy shares of Elliott now because I think he's going to get more touches going forward. And then conversely, if the Buccaneers were down big in that game, I would be looking at it as, okay, I want shares of the Bucs passing game because I know they're going to be throwing the ball a lot in the second half. So I pick out, maybe it's like, oh, Antonio Brown, he maybe doesn't have any receptions, but he's been targeted 6 times so far in the first half. They're down by a bunch of points. He looks like somebody that Tom Brady is locking in on. So pay attention to game flow. And like you mentioned there, Eytan, with the ability to buy and sell players after lock. I think that is something that's going to be an edge in football in terms of trading after the game starts.
I'm curious, just to follow up with Zeke, because I think you make a great point about being able to take advantage of, especially if the Cowboys offense is clicking in the air, the counter that we expect with Dallas being up. I do wonder, though, how do you approach pre-IPO somebody like Ezekiel Elliott? We know that Zach Martin's out, Lyle Collins, right? We're still dealing with the offensive line being depleted. Do you think that could be an example of somebody who, under normal circumstances, would be higher up or maybe a little bit more aggressively bid on, and you could take advantage of maybe some concern with this offensive line being depleted and realizing that, look, there's a pretty good chance that even with all of that, Ezekiel Elliott could have a decent start to the game, and then all of a sudden his stock moves up, and maybe you can counter that, as we mentioned, in game.
I think it's hard to predict, like, this is going to sound silly, but I think it's hard to predict exactly which guys are going to do well at the start relative to what their IPO bidding price is. So, you know, everything is relative. So on the site, we currently have Zeke Elliott projected with a fair IPO price of $8.96. And to me, I wouldn't be looking at it as, oh, I think he's going to start slow or I think he's going to start poorly. At least in the IPO period, I would just be looking at our projections, both in terms of fantasy points and in terms of what we have the value projected. If they come in well below that number, then I'd be interested in them. And looking at Zeke in particular, one thing that, and also this is really far out, but if I'm just kind of trying to project where I think players could ultimately end up being bid on, if you look at the projections over on Jock Market right now, they currently have Zeke projected as the 9th overall scoring player, and their projections have him scoring 13.15 fantasy points. If you look at our projections, we have Zeke projected for 14.29 fantasy points, and we have him as the 7th projected fantasy scorer. So that's something that would lead me to think that there's a chance that Zeke will end up ultimately getting bid in the IPO period for less than we have him projected for, you know, just based on our projections being higher than the ones on Jock Market, which I think a lot of people are basing decisions on. So just because of that, I think Zeke is going to be a player that I would ultimately want to end up targeting. But once again, it's all going to come down to what the actual IPO bidding is on him. And 896 is what we have as the fair value.
Yeah. And again, that's always going to be something that we have to factor in, the fair value, the break even point, to realize, what you're bidding on and where this guy should finish as far as being a top fantasy performer in order to make a positive return, because there are plenty of opportunities for people to mess that up and basically turn out underwater when you're done with all of your bidding, something that you try to avoid both in Jock Market and the real market.
Yeah, and also I want to address some of the questions we got in the YouTube chat so far. As we had from Preacher Son. He asked how much time is needed to be profitable. And one thing that's kind of interesting about Jock Market is just because you have the ability to buy and sell players after the slate start, it doesn't mean you have to. So if there's somebody you get as a tremendous value in the IPO period, like let's just say, for instance, we have Antonio Brown projected for 829 right now, just pulling out a random player. Let's say you're able to buy shares of him for $4 before the slate starts. You could just sit on that and you'd be projected to be profitable. You don't have to be constantly checking during the game as the slate goes on. It's certainly fun to do that. It's a different way to be profitable, but you kind of make of it whatever you want, and you could play this DFS game however you want. Also, if you just want to bid on players in the IPO period, then root for them as the game goes on. You don't have to buy and sell players after the slate locks. You can if you choose to. You could also, if you want to, you could just try to buy shares of players after the game has already started. You don't have to try to bid on players in the IPO. So there's a lot of different ways you could play on Jock Market. You could just bid in the IPO period, and you could legitimately be on the site for 5 minutes before the slate locks, bid on a player you think is undervalued, and you could be profitable that way if you use the projections we have over on the site. Or if you want to follow around, you could sit on Jock Market and play for the entire 4 hours, the IPO period. You could also sit around and buy and sell players the entire time the game's going on. So there's a lot of different ways you could play and make money on Jock Market. There's not one thing that I'd say this is the amount of time it takes.
It's a great point. And I think just kind of looking at not necessarily hitting the guy that you're bidding on, like you mentioned Brady, and jumping in there and putting a max bid for Brady, and you don't get him. Now, it's a little bit, when you look at the one game slate, you're going to have to be a little bit more savvy, but such is life across the board. When you're dealing with more games, especially, you're going to have the ability to really take advantage of game flow and be ahead of it. And look, if anybody's live betting, if anybody has been paying attention to just watching football games, then you kind of have a feel, at least ahead of time, you're going to get a feel of how things shift. So by no means are you SOL if you don't get in on the IPO, or no means is the day over for you by any means. To Greg's point, that's part of what separates a lot with Jock Market, is that you make your money. You can make a lot of bones knowing and kind of predicting game flow, even if it's not as obvious, especially I'd add, if it's not as obvious to the average person watching, where all of a sudden you're getting ahead of it, buying low, and then realizing that your strategy is paying off. Again, if it's a team that may be down a ton, right? And then having to throw, as we've seen Dallas consistently last year before Prescott goes down.
Yeah, for sure. And then, also there's a handful of players who will be able to target in those kind of scenarios. Like I mentioned before, if the Colts aren't playing tomorrow, so I wouldn't worry about them. But if the Cowboys are down tomorrow and it's going to be Dak Prescott who's throwing the ball a lot, it is a little hard to try to discern the wide receivers and who are going to be the priorities. But one thing that's kind of nice about once the game's already started, we get a little bit of an idea of what the game plan is. If the Cowboys are down and we see a target share distribution where it's like, Michael Gallup only has 1 target, and then maybe CeeDee Lamb has, 7, Amari Cooper has 8, then we kind of know who the top guys are going to be on Dallas for that game and what their game plan is in that particular matchup. So I do think that with football, there's a little more room to kind of see players' values change a lot as the game goes on. Baseball is so event oriented where of course you could always buy and sell on baseball players after the game starts, particularly, pitchers, if there's reason to think they've gotten lucky or something so far. But still, if somebody hits a home run in baseball, they hit a home run. Those points aren't really going nowhere or anything. Football, there's still so many fantasy points to be scored throughout the course of the game. And there's always reasons to think that based on game flow, players will either start to perform better or worse from a fantasy perspective.
Is there anybody that you can start to look a little bit, I guess, lower on the projections? You mentioned, we talked about Ezekiel Elliott in Jock Market has him number 9 as far as the top fantasy performer with a projection of 13.1 fantasy points. And if you start to look down a little bit less, and now again, you're getting into depth and you're getting into really maximizing where we have on Awesemo our projection versus where you can find some wiggle room on Jock Market. Speaking of which, you should be using our code Awesemo, AWESEMO, for a free match of up to $50 on your deposit. So you drop $50, use our promo code Awesemo on Jock Market, and we'll match that $50 for you. $100 is plenty of money to start off and get some damage done here. But I wonder if there is, like Ronald Jones, for example. Jock Market has him projected at 13th with a fantasy point projection of 8.64. And we know that there is definitely the carry share that you're going to have in the backfield with Fournette as well. But at the same time, there may be just the big play element of it, or the belief that Ronald Jones is going to get more action. So maybe you do jump in early on the IPO, knowing that, to what we just mentioned with Ezekiel Elliott, Greg, this is a much lesser example of somebody who's probably going to get lesser bid.
Yeah, and one thing I'll point out also, just talking about some of the passing game versus the running game here, at least our projections compared to what the projections currently are on Jock Market, we're a little higher on the running games and not quite as high on the passing games. Now, our projections like Tom Brady and Dak Prescott quite a bit. We like them more than any of the skill position players by a pretty wide margin. We currently have Tom Brady project for 22.44 fantasy points over on Jock Market. Dak Prescott project for 22.15. So the fair IPO prices we have for these two quarterbacks, $16.88 for Brady. I mentioned that at the top of the show. Dak Prescott, $15.87. The next player that we have projected for is Amari Cooper, and his fair IPO price is $10.44. So a pretty big drop off. But if you go over to the projections on Jock Market, they have the receivers very close to the quarterbacks. They have Brady and Prescott about similar to our projections. They have Godwin project for 20.93 fantasy points. We have him at 16.06. They have Mike Evans at 20.05. We have Mike Evans at 14.93. So just based on that information, it seems to me that these wide receivers could go really overbid based on our projections, and it would make more sense to focus on the quarterbacks. And then also potentially the running game. We talked about Ezekiel Elliott. You mentioned Ronald Jones there. Ronald Jones, we have projected for 11.44 fantasy points and a fair IPO price at $6.34. They currently have Ronald Jones projected for 8.64 fantasy points. So that is somebody who we'll see what happens when the IPO prices are starting to get bid on tomorrow. But it wouldn't be surprising to me if Ronald Jones ultimately ends up going for under market relative to our projections.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically the whole game here, is to try to find as much as you can under market based off of what people are predicting, the game flow of it, and maybe trying to find somebody who on the surface isn't expected to be overutilized. I mean, again, Antonio Brown jumps out as kind of a wild card here in this game with Godwin and Mike Evans, especially if a lot of people, and I don't, I think that there's a lot of truth to it, Greg, that this is going to be a more consistent bounce back year for Mike Evans, at least from a DFS standpoint, more consistent. But at the same time, Antonio Brown has proven that he can be a very legit threat in this offense, despite being that third wide receiver. So kind of balancing where we have him projected on site to where, again, at 7. So this is a guy who's projected higher than both Elliott and Gallup below him from 9, 8 respectively. How much maneuverability there may be with an IPO of Brown and maybe him being a little underbid.
I tend to think, actually, just based on the projections that are up on Jock Market, where they have Antonio Brown projected for 15.75 fantasy points. We have him for 13.95. And that's the same I mentioned with the other wide receivers. Every single wide receiver in this game that matters, we have projected for less fantasy points than what's up on Jock Market. I mentioned Godwin. I mentioned Mike Evans. CeeDee Lamb, they have projected for 19.63 fantasy points. We have him for 16.71. Amari Cooper, 19.31 on Jock Market. We have him for 16.67. It seems to me that all of the wide receivers are getting over projected there. There's a good chance that means that the IPO bidding could end up being a little bit higher than what I would ultimately want to bid for them. Got
it. Yeah. So you mentioned Brady and Prescott. Again, these guys are 1-2. as far as the projections are concerned. I don't know if that, how does that impact Prescott? We talked about Brady, but how does that then have the ripple effect for Prescott's IPO, where we have so many, basically every wide receiver, to your phrase there, that matters in this game, being under on the projections? Is that something that then impacts to maybe more negative standpoint where you're looking at Prescott in the IPO?
No, I think it's ultimately positive, because if people are going to be overbidding on wide receivers, then the quarterbacks ultimately might not end up getting bid up to a share price that would be high enough, because we have the quarterbacks just project for so many more fantasy points than every other player in this game, that it makes them so much more likely to be the top or second highest scoring players in this game, which ultimately have the biggest payouts on Jock Market. So when we have a 6 fantasy point difference between Brady, Prescott, and then the skill position players in this game, that's ultimately why we have Brady projected with a fair IPO price of $16.88, Prescott $15.87, and then the next group of players, it's Amari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb, Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, all in the $9 to $10 range. So to me, I look at these high-end guys, and I think that I'm probably going to ultimately be wanting to target Brady and Prescott in the IPO bidding.
Anybody else that you really like targeting in the IPO phase that we haven't touched on? And again, using in the backdrop our own rankings on site that you can take full advantage of, especially for anybody who doesn't have the ability, which is pretty simple, to sign up and be a part of what we're doing on Awesemo, but not using our own rankings as far as a companion to the IPO phase.
A lot of it's weird, because every single pass catcher in this game is generally projected way higher than what we have them projected for. So the players that ultimately look good to me, I mentioned the quarterbacks, we mentioned Zeke Elliott, we mentioned Ronald Jones, Leonard
What about
Fournette.
Gronk?
Gronk is projected really highly over on Jock Market. They actually have Gronk projected for a comparable amount of ownership, a comparable amount of fantasy points to Zeke. So they have Zeke projected for 13.15 fantasy points. We have Zeke for 14.29. Then they have Gronk at 12.34 fantasy points. So only, 1/8 of a fantasy point less than Elliott. We have Gronk project for 7.9 fantasy points. So that's a full 7 fantasy points less than we have Zeke projected for. So to me, Gronk is another guy who I think could end up being getting overbid a little bit. So there's also an ability to short players over on Jock Market. So if some of these guys end up going for, really exorbitant prices and you want to short them, that's also an option. And that's something that I think actually it could make sense to do with Gronk if he does get bid up as high as it looks like he potentially could on Jock Market, where, they currently have him projected a 10th overall score on the slate, and that doesn't really line up where we have him.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of guys, and especially when you look lower on this list, it's not as easy. Clearly we're dealing with the one game on the slate here, but it's really not easy to marry our own rankings and find some jump out value here, because it's either going to be, to your point about the pass catchers being overvalued compared to our rankings, or putting a lot of faith in OJ Howard or Giovanni Bernard, which just from the surface standpoint doesn't really match up and add up to it, unless you find some sort of narrow game plan that works in their favor, which is always a possibility. And then you're sitting on a hot ticket. But I think that's how difficult it is to kind of maneuver once you get down to those names past where we were with even Ronald Jones ranked 13th on Jock Market.
Yeah, and those guys at the bottom, I mean, once it starts to get really thin in terms of projection. So you mentioned OJ Howard. We have him projected for 3.38 fantasy points. It's hard to think he's a really viable option. Cam Brate, we have projected for 3.34. Giovanni Bernard, who is going to be the tertiary running back for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It looks like in the preseason he got injured. He wasn't going to play week 1. Now it appears he is going to play, except who knows to what extent. I expect he's going to be, kind of like a third down role and a pass catcher role. But if he's not totally healthy, who knows how many reps he's going to get on the field. We only project for 3 fantasy points. So at least in the IPO period, in terms of players I'm going to be targeting, it's just the guys who I'm fairly confident in the workload in, which is ultimately going to be the quarterbacks. The wide receivers, I would feel comfortable, except I think they're over-projected over on Jock Market, which could lead to higher IPO bids. But the guys who I think I'm going to be targeting, just to reiterate, Tom Brady, Dak Prescott, Zeke Elliott, Ronald Jones, and Leonard Fournette. Those overall look like the strongest group of players that I would want to be going after right now.
Last one real quick as we wind down, remind you to hit the promo code Awesemo for a $50 match on your first deposit at Jock Market, just to look at the difference. And he's the only guy, but again, I'm really pushing your terminology of wide receivers that matter here. Gallup is 8th at 15.1 fantasy. Oh, no, pardon me. I stand corrected. He was in there. I was trying to work something else out. That's fine. You addressed that earlier. We should end on the note that you had and not me trying to muddy the waters even further here. All right. At G. Ehrenberg, DFS is how you follow Greg. I'm at Shander Show. Take his advice. All right. I see Greg active on Twitter as far as anybody who has questions, advice, and this is not your typical way of winning money in the DFS world. So we want to make sure that you are educated and prepared to move on here and win some money Thursday night, and then ultimately week 1 on Sunday at Jock Market. Everything that you need at Jock Market. Download the app, get playing. Thanks to Greg. Thanks to Tyler. Thanks to you out there. Hit us up with a like. Make sure you're subscribed to our channels if you're not already. And that promo code, again, Awesemo, for a $50 match on your first deposit. Have a great night and good luck.